Okay, in Tanya, we're in the middle of Perek Lamed. We're in the middle of chapter 30. At the bottom, it's 136. We're all the way at the bottom of the page. On top, it's page 76. And the bottom is 136. But we're all the way at the end of the 2 lines from the end of the page. Now, the Rebbe in Perek Lamed, chapter 30, was explaining another way that a person could come to the level of humility to break the body if the body's too thick, that the flame of the neshama can't catch on to it. So now the Rebbe said in Perek Chavtes, you break yourself, you put yourself down, you bust yourself up, all those things. But he says, it's another method you could use. And that is what he says, don't judge somebody until you're in their place, which means maybe his place is causing him to sin. And then with all the great, and then we learned last time that the Rebbe says, ask yourself the question, are you demanding from yourself the same thing you are demanding from the person that you're telling to change his place is causing him to sin, and you're telling him, no, you still have to overcome your Yetzer Hara, even though it's burning, you still have to overcome your Yetzer Hara. So the Rebbe says, are you demanding from yourself the same thing? And he says, first in Sur Meirah and Aseitei, are you learning like you should? Are you davening like you should? Are you giving tzedakah like you should? Are you making an effort? Are you fighting with your Yetzer Hara in your aspects? And now with 2 lines from the end of the page, of 136 at the bottom, 76 on top. Because if a person learns even a little bit beyond their nature, that's called Harei Milchama Ktana. It's only a little battle. There's no connection whatsoever compared to the battle that the guy's out there in the world, that he has to fight his Yetzer Hara, which is which is burning like a fire. The Mikra Rasha Gama, that the guy is called a Rasha. If you got, like Dr. Rebbe said before, that doesn't justify the sinner. But you have to understand. So you're saying, okay, I'm breaking my nature too. I'm going to learn a little bit extra. Dr. Rebbe says, you're learning a little bit extra has no comparison whatsoever to the battle against the Yetzer Hara that's burning with a burning fire. And the guy's called the Rasha if he doesn't conquer it. To be subdued and crushed before Hashem. And he says, what's the difference if it's Akol Mitzvah Samelech, HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Yochel Meyuchel. Now, the Rebbe says like this. The understanding of 613 mitzvahs, 248 positive, 365 negative. There's no difference in mitzvahs. That's why it says you should never weigh mitzvahs one against the next. Why shouldn't you weigh mitzvahs one against the next? Because every mitzvah is what Hashem wants us to do. All positive mitzvahs at one point, Hashem wants me to do it. All negative mitzvahs have at one point, Hashem doesn't want you to do it. Now, both of them together, though, is to reveal godliness in the world. There's no difference between positive, as far as Hashem is concerned, there's no difference if we're keeping a positive mitzvah or we're not transgressing a negative mitzvah. There's no difference between them. Why? Because it's what Hashem wants. Meaning like this. We learned already in the past. What's the difference between positive mitzvahs and negative mitzvahs? Positive mitzvahs, you make a bracha. Sheketshanu, b'mitzvesa, v'tzivanu, whatever the mitzvah may be. There is no bracha on a negative commandment. There is no bracha. There's not one negative commandment of all 365 that has a mitzvah, a bracha. There is no bracha. Why isn't there a bracha on negative commandments? So the answer is very simple. The bracha is Asher kitshanu b'mitzvayis v'tzivanu. Hashem sanctified us by doing a mitzvah. When a Jew does a positive mitzvah, they are revealing godliness in the world. They're taking a physical piece of wool and making tzitzis out of it. They're taking a physical piece of wax and they're making candles for it. They're making a mitzvah out of it. You are sanctifying the physical world and you are bringing kedusha into the world. That's why the brach is Asher kitshanu b'mitzvayis v'tzivanu. Hashem commanded us to do it. When you don't eat pig, when you don't eat treif, you don't speak lashon hara, you don't do any of the three, you don't wear shatnez, any of the 365 negative commandments, you are not actively doing anything to bring godliness into the world. So what am I accomplishing when I don't eat non-kosher food? What I'm doing is I'm not feeding evil. In other words, a person has a neshama, they're connected to Hashem. If a person takes this power that we have, which is godly from the neshama, and we eat treifa food, non-kosher food with it, we are actually lowering holiness into evil. So what happens? Evil becomes powerful. We fed it. If I don't eat not kosher, then evil by itself is like darkness. It has no entity. It has no existence. The existence of evil that Hashem created in the world is only when we feed it. If we don't feed it, it can't exist because we're weakening it. Therefore, what happens when a person does not transgress a negative mitzvah? They keep the negative mitzvah. They don't eat treif. Okay, what are they doing? By not eating treif, they're not feeding evil and giving evil power. If evil is not fed, evil gets weaker. But that's also what Hashem wants. As Alter Rebbe said, what is the difference if it's asay treif or surbeira? What's the difference if it's positive mitzvahs or negative mitzvahs? The Alter Rebbe says, Hakol mitzvahs hamelech kodesh baruch hu yochanan. It's all what Hashem wants. So there is no difference. So now the question is like this. Am I fighting my Yetzer Hara the same way that guy is? And the answer is you're not. Okay, you're going to learn a little bit extra. It doesn't come close to the battle that guy has with his Yetzer Hara, which is burning. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe says, V'chein shar mitzvahs, same thing with all other mitzvahs. B'frat b'davar sheb'mamein, especially money, like Avedis HaTzedakah. Why does Alter Rebbe mention this? Because the Alter Rebbe later on in Tanya says that tzedakah is the mitzvah of this generation. The generation before Mashiach is to give tzedakah. And he says like this, so how much more so am I breaking my Yetzer Hara to give tzedakah in a way that my Yetzer Hara would be burning at me not to do it? We don't. And then the Alter Rebbe asks this. Even in the level of not doing evil, Yachol kol ish maskil, every intellectual person is able, limse benafshi, to find within himself, she'nesor legamri meyara bakol mikol. We also don't even evil. We don't not do evil when there any time there needs to be a war. The Alter Rebbe says, think to yourself. Okay, I don't eat chazer, I don't eat that. I'm keeping all the negative mitzvahs. Are you keeping all the negative mitzvahs when a battle is coming up? In other words, I'll give you a simple example. Somebody called me today about cheating on an insurance claim, whatever. Okay, there's a lot of money they can make. So now the question is, if I write down something, I'll be able to get another $10,000. It's a test. The person at $10,000 is money. So now the question is, I'm having a little battle, with the Yetzer Hara. Even Surmera, okay? Cheating is not allowed. Lying is not allowed. So the question is, am I going to give in and not lie and cheat? And if it'd be $100,000, would I not lie and cheat? Do people not lie and cheat? So you ask yourself, even a surmera, turning away from positive, am I so careful? Yeah, I won't eat trade. But am I so careful in kashrus, let's say, in a way that I have to fight my Yetzer Hara with that? Or eating something I really don't need to eat. He says, are you fine? And he says, Afilu pachas merachanal. He said, and he gives examples, very interesting examples. If you're in the middle of a juicy conversation, but a good one, or or you're talking about something bad about somebody else. Even if it's not heavy duty lashon hara, it's like they say in Yiddish, schwache. It's not heavy real dozer lashon hara. It's weak lashon hara. And he said, "Avshu emes." Even if it's true, are we fighting ourselves? You're in the middle of a good lashon hara session. He says, think to yourself, are you the type of a guy who's, oh, sorry, cold turkey, it's gone, over, finished? Not necessarily. So what are you judging the other person that because of his place? His place, is your place and your things, are you fighting the same battle? And he says even more. Even if it's to justify himself. It's interesting. Sometimes people will say something not proper to justify themselves. And now the Rebbe quotes a Gemara. Rabbi Nasi had a number of sons, all great tzaddikim. One of them was Shimon. And the Gemara about Master that Al Rebbe quotes, Al Rebbe doesn't say the story, but the story was that Shimon showed Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, his father, a get that somebody wrote. And Rabbi looked at it and he said, no good. So he said, so his father, who wrote such a thing? He said to his son, you wrote such a thing? Like, how did you write such a terrible get for somebody? So he said to his father, Lav anor kasvei, I didn't write the get. Yehuda the tailor wrote it. He didn't speak bad. He just said a fact. You're blaming me for writing it. He says, Father, I didn't write it. Amalei Rabbi said to him, Klach mi lashon hara. Stop speaking. Get away from Yetzer Hara, from lashon hara. Stop speaking lashon hara. He didn't mean anything bad about the guy. It wasn't a terrible thing. It wasn't a properly written get. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi blamed the son. The son said to him, Father, I didn't write it. Why are you screaming at me? So his father said, stop talking. You're talking lashon hara. All of us know that when we need to justify ourselves, well, we could say, as they say in your dray a cup a little. We can make it a little bit crazy. So he says again, there's very common, often by a person himself in his life. I just want to answer one question over here. Angels and spiritual beings cannot feed evil like humans because they have no free will. That is correct. The only ones that feed evil are the Jews that have the free choice to do it or not to do it, and we choose to do it. Yes. Okay, these are very common that we give in and we don't do what we're not fighting with the Yetzirah the way we should. And especially in the concept of the Kadesh Atzmei B'Mutale. We learned before in Perek Vav and Zion, the Alter Rebbe speaks about kosher desires, kosher temptations, food which is kosher. It's not, God forbid, we're eating something treif. But the Torah says, Kadeshim Tihiyu. There's a mitzvah in the Torah, and as Alter Rebbe says, Midaraisa is biblical. There's a mitzvah in the Torah, Kadeshim Tihiyu should be holy. So the Rishonim write, the Ramban, others, that it doesn't mean Kadeshim be holy by keeping mitzvahs, because it already says keeping mitzvahs. What does it mean, Kadeshim Tihiyu? It means you need to sanctify yourself even with those things which are halachically permitted to you. That means you can have kosher food. But if you're going to dress like a pig or guzzle like a guzzler, and you're not going to sanctify yourself, and you say, well, it's permissible, that you are transgressing a biblical mitzvah of Kadeshim Tihiyu. There's a biblical mitzvah that in kosher things, you have to sanctify yourself. What do you mean sanctify yourself? Eating it only l'shem shamayim, eating it in order to live, not to fress it and to guzzle it and to, there was a story in World War II. Jews Nabuch in the concentration camp, they had to eat treif. Never, they would die otherwise. But there was one guy, in Yiddish, there's an expression for smakev in the lippen. The smakev in the lippen means you lick your lips, when you really eat something that you really like, you lick it off the last drop of the lips, you lick it off. There was this guy that was eating treif in the concentration camps, which he was allowed to do. But a Yid came over to him and said, I understand you need to eat treif, but you have to lick the lips. If a smakev in the lip, you have to enjoy it yet. You have to eat because you have to eat. If not, you're going to die. So you're allowed to eat treif for food, but you have to enjoy it. You should be upset that you're eating treif. So he says, even in permissible things, the Alter Rebbe is saying the person should think to themselves, I'm busy judging everybody else why they're sinning, wherever they are around the world. And the Alter Rebbe says, are you fighting yourself the same battle in Sur Meirah, not transgressing negative, positive mitzvahs? Are you fighting with your own Yetzirah not to continue to stop cold turkey in the middle of a conversation which is forbidden? And Alter Rebbe says even more so, which is more common, sanctifying yourself with those things which are permissible. Are you fighting with your Yetzirah in those things? He said definitely not. And he says Shu Midaraisa, which is biblical, like it says Kamesh Kadeshim Tiyu Viskadishtam, you should be holy. And he says, even if it's only rabbinic things, Divrei Seifim Chamurim Divrei Torah, in many aspects, rabbinic things are stricter than biblical things. So he says like this: Al Shekol Elu, all these sins, the easy sins, Hein Ma'avene Sh'Adam Dash Ba'Kevah. It's sins that a person steps on with his heel. Meaning, like Rashi says, Ekev Tishmun. He says even those mitzvahs that people step on because it's not an important mitzvah. It's not a big, not from the top 10. It's not a big mitzvah. The not only that, the Gemara has an interesting expression. A person will sin once, they'll feel a little guilty. They'll sin again, they'll sin a few times, then it becomes permissible. Okay? It's an Aver Vishon and Nasla Keheta, the Gemara says. If you keep sinning the same thing in your mind, it becomes permissible. By the way, there's a very, very interesting, important Chassidic concept that the Alter Rebbe is alluding to over here. And that is, when a person sins and they're have guilt, that's okay. I mean, not good to sin. But the fact that you feel guilty means you're still connected. You know when it's a problem? When you sin and it doesn't even bother you. That shows that you're really disconnected. Something evil that you don't even feel bad about it, that's no good. That means you're really disconnected. I don't want to get into it now because it's not this proper place, but there are many people years ago, even today, that say pornography should be allowed because people will keep seeing it and it won't do anything to them and it should be good. According to Chassidus, it's just the opposite. If somebody sees something they shouldn't and they feel guilt, that's a good sign. That means you're still connected. If you're going to start seeing things and it doesn't even bother you, it doesn't mean you're so holy that evil doesn't bother you. It means you're so corrupt that you're so disconnected to Hashem that it doesn't touch you at all. That's even worse. And now the Rebbe says, Avul Be'emes, truth is, in your day of Sefer, if the guy knows a little bit, torment himself, the guy knows a little bit out of it. Umachzik b'teiras Hashem, and he strengthens the Torah of Hashem. V'kives elikim yachbeis, and he'll want godliness, and yet he sins. Gadol aveinim and say, his sin is greater than it could be handled. Vashmasei Godela, and his sin is doubled bad. The kifle kiflaim, then even worse. Mashe'ena nilcham u'mizgaber layitzrei, that he's not overcoming his Yetzer Hara, like the battle of the lower the low. The guys that sit in the corners. Now, the Rebbe is saying another point. A guy that knows what Hashem is all about and sins, even a little sin, is infinitely worse than a person who doesn't know anything and sins. Because Al Rebbe is going to quote a Gemara at the end. By illiterate people, Hashem considers their intentional sins accidental because they don't know. They don't know. They didn't learn. They didn't doubt. They don't know. They're ignorant. So when they sin, they don't realize the severity of it. But a Jew who is learned and a Jew who is from and a Jew understand what Hashem is, or to the best of our ability, and to understand what happens when we separate ourselves from Hashem, man, you're much worse than those guys. You're much worse than the low people who maybe will do a low sin, but what do you want from them? They don't know. And that's not how the Rebbe says. Your sin is kifle kiflayim. That you're not fighting with you know better. So you for sure should be fighting with Yetzer Hara. Now, this tremendous fighting of the burning flame Yetzer Hara. It's worse than the sin of the low of the low. The bum sitting on the corners. Who are far from Hashem in the state. And he says, they're not to blame so much. Do they know what godliness is? Do they know what a mitzvah means? Do they understand what an aveda, terrible thing, what an aveda does? They don't. So now the question is, who do you think you are anyway? You think because you're from, you're better than the low of the low? He says, what are you talking about? They don't know better and you know better. So why aren't you fighting Yetzer Hara? And this is one interesting point that the Rebbe emphasized many times. A frum Jew cannot think he's any better than a Jew who's not frum. You keep more Torah mitzvahs. Yeah, but look what you're supposed to be keeping and look what they're supposed to. How do they know any better? You know better and you're still not keeping. The The religious Jew is worse than them. I mentioned the story. The Rebbe Rashab was Fabrengi once. It was the great chassid of Yitzchak the Masmid. And Yitzchak the Masmid started telling the Rebbe Rashab a statement, and the Rebbe Rashab cut him off. And he said, you know, the evil of Amalek, the Gemara says, the Medrash says, what was the unique evil of Amalek? Yodeya Esri Beinai. The 7 nations of Canaan were emotional lovers. They had no understanding of godliness. What was Reish's Goyim Amalek? What was the unique evil of Amalek? They understood God, Yodeya Esri Beinai, and yet they rebelled against him. That's worse. Amalek is worse than the 7 nations of Canaan. They're emotional. What do they know? They have an understanding of God. They don't. Amalek had an understanding of Hashem and yet he rebelled. So the Rebbe the Masmid basically, the Rebbe Rashab didn't let him finish the statement. The Rebbe the Masmid was telling the Rebbe Rashab, so then you know who's Amalek today? Chabadniks. They learn Chassidus, they learn about godliness, and yet they're not where they should be. So they're worse than the people that don't learn Chassidus. The Rebbe Rashab cut him off midway. But this is not for somebody to think about somebody else. Alter Rebbe is saying, think to yourself. Who do you think you are when you are not having a battle with your Yetzer Hara the way you should be having it, and especially when you know better? And he says, okay, you can't compare the sinners with the lower of the low that don't know about godliness. They don't understand what their sin is doing. Ka'ashmas, like the sin of Kol HaKarev al Hashem, to the ones that are mamish close to Hashem, and like the Gemara says, Taka by Acher, okay, the Acher was Elisha ben Avi, the teacher of Meir that became an Apikaris, and the Gemara says about Acher, Sheyada bichvedi. Acher was one of the greatest sages of the Gemara. Acher knew God's wisdom, God's greatness, and he rebelled against them. So he says, Lachain, Ahmed Hazal, therefore the Gemara says about the low people, their intentional sins are considered accidental sins. By a Talmud Chacham, an accidental sin is considered an intentional sin. Because you should know better. So Perek Lamed Aleph is, Perek Lamed is hereby finished without the Rebbe saying a person has to think to himself, I think I'm better than everybody else who's not as religious as me. And now the Rebbe says, stop for a minute and think, are you fighting with yourself the same level that guy's fighting with himself? And because you're not, the Rebbe said, the fact is you're not. So don't think you're high and mighty. You are not really anything. There was one more question. Wouldn't Hashem be more pleased if we suffer hunger than to eat non-kosher? Yeah, but we're talking about when a person would die if he does not hungry. We're talking about if a person would die if they didn't eat the non-kosher meat, then the Torah says the halacha is the non-kosher meat becomes kosher. In fact, you even make a bracha on it. Okay, anyway, that's it for today.